don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with Susan Kaiser Greenland, who is a return guest to the podcast. As you'll hear us talk, she was on the podcast, I think in 2019, as we were talking about her mindful games work. Susan has a new book titled Real World Enlightenment, Discovering Ordinary Magic in Everyday Life. And while this may not seem like an education-specific topic, we had a wide-ranging discussion about mindfulness, meditation, the stresses of everyday life, and of course of being a teacher, and thinking about how to and when to and how not to apply these kinds of things in a classroom and in an educational setting. I always enjoy talking with Susan, and hopefully you find it helpful. Speaking of helpful, if you're interested in help with your professional development and professional learning, please navigate to wegrowteachers.com. There you'll see our professional development offerings and blogs and this podcast. Speaking of podcasts, I'm excited to announce that we will be hosting a Thought Stretchers podcast live discussion that is sure to be a lively event, January 21st, and that will feature two previous podcast guests, Neil McCluskey and Josh Cowan, as we'll talk about school choice, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And if you RSVP for that, you'll be able to join us and add your questions. We'll be hosting that as part of our Thought Stretchers education community, which you can find at thoughtstretchers.org, and the event will be publicized on wegrowteachers.com as well. So I encourage you to RSVP for that if you're interested in the school choice debate. And lastly, I wanted to thank those of you who responded and replied to the last podcast, which was an AI-generated podcast from a blog piece that I published as sort of an experiment. Some of you responded on the Thought Stretchers education community at thoughtstretchers.org, and I also got a few emails. Certainly an interesting topic, and again, very wild how it took that blog piece and turned it into what seemed like an authentic conversation. If you haven't listened to that, and if you are so inclined, feel free to respond to me either on our Thought Stretchers education community or by email at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Susan Kaiser Greenland. I am here with Susan Kaiser Greenland. Susan was last on the podcast. I was looking back in 2019, but it seems just like yesterday. And then we were talking, I think, about your work, the Mindful Games and Mindful Games activity cards. But she's got a new book called Real World Enlightenment, Discovering Ordinary Magic in Everyday Life, which isn't specific to education, but I'm sure there are lots of ties that we're going to talk about with mindfulness and all those kinds of things. But as I want to make sure people have a sense of who you are, because maybe they are not familiar with you and hadn't listened to the 2019 version, give them the elevator pitch of who you are.
Well, my name's Susan Kaiser Greenland. I joke that I'm a recovering lawyer. I was a lawyer for 20 years, contract law, that sort of thing. I started volunteering in public schools and at the Boys and Girls Club, teaching meditation to kids because I was practicing myself and practicing meditation with my own kids. At that time, there really wasn't any meditation or mindfulness in kids. We even had to kind of sneak it in. We'd go in and do some breathing while we were gardening and that kind of thing. So that is my background. But although I started with kids, I've really been working with adults for the last 10, 15 of those years, because I started this in about 2000. And the adults I've worked with have been almost entirely caregivers, either teachers or parents or clinicians, people who wanted to learn mindfulness and meditation so that they could help the kids in their lives. And what I found, which I think might be helpful to your audience, is I found that many, many people came wanting to help kids, and they had tried meditation themselves, but that just didn't land for them. But when they started doing these activities for kids, these simple, short activities where we play, we practice, we share, we apply, all of a sudden it started to make some sense. And so that's how was their entryway into mindfulness and meditation themselves. So that's basically my background. And I'm a mom, 2 grown kids, long marriage, live in California in Brooklyn.
Yeah. So mindfulness and meditation are something I've dabbled in, more mindfulness than meditation. I think we talked a bit about this in 2019. I'm certainly a fan of mindfulness, and as I went through my divorce, I think we even talked about this in 2019 when we recorded that podcast. The use of some meditation just to sort of calm my mind because of such the just the busyness and so many thoughts that were in some ways intrusive and just made it almost hard to sort of operate. But thinking about this with kids, and I have 2 kids, of course, 2 daughters, and try to help them be mindful and take notice of the moments and what's important, what's not important. So I guess maybe like what's the sort of pitch for why, because it's different for kids and adults, right? Like why we want them and how we want them to be thinking about mindfulness and perhaps even meditation.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there. The first thing that I would say that is different about kids and adults is it's very rare that anybody has ever come in all of my years of doing this that was a child, not a teenager, but a child, and said, "Hey, I want to learn to meditate." Usually they're kind of a conscript audience. Their parents want them to meditate. Their teachers want them to meditate. Their therapist wants them to meditate. They, not so much. So that's why I think it's really crucial to emphasize playfulness in this kind of practice with kids. And because you just never want the kids 10 years later to say, "Oh my goodness, I had that mindfulness class and I hated it." So playfulness is really key with children. And again, it's also true with adults, but it's very specifically necessary with kids. And one of the reasons is you want it to be fun for them. But another reason is when somebody settles down in their mind and body, what's going to happen is a lot of different thoughts and feelings will come up, both physical and mental. So if they sit down with a smile on their face because they just sang a song or they played a game, or especially if it was moving so that they got rid of some speedy energy, they're going to have fewer layers of stuff that's got to settle. It'll just be easier for them to settle into a sense of peacefulness and calm and connection. So those are reasons playfulness is important. There are a lot of other things to consider as far as developmental appropriateness for different practices at different ages, but it's not that hard to do once you just kind of put your mind to it, especially if you're already working with kids.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the book, and then I think we'll probably circle back to some of those things. The book is, as I said, Real World Enlightenment, Discovering Ordinary Magic in Everyday Life. Why did you write the book? Like, what's the book about?
Well, it's actually the last piece of this program that I've been teaching for all these years for kids and in schools and clinics. I've always taught just general attention, balance, compassion, and playfulness. That's the kind of the umbrella categories. And that trains life skills like focusing, quieting, seeing, reframing, caring, connection. But even back to my first book in 2010, I've been talking about these universal themes that cut through all the wisdom traditions that lead to kind of a wiser and more compassionate way of navigating the world. So that's what this book is about. It really is focusing on these universal themes that are not unique to any particular wisdom tradition that really make life a little bit easier and a little more joyful.
And so what are some of the big pieces that you'd say you want people to sort of come away with from this book? As I read it, I certainly have some things to pull on, but I'm curious, what are the I don't know, 5, 6 points or 3 points, or I'm sure your publicist has a set of bullet points.
Yeah. So I guess let's start with the themes that people are probably already familiar with, especially if there's people listening to this podcast who are from schools and who are already interested in mindfulness and implementing it. Themes like change, how everything's changing all the time. Things like interconnection, how we're all connected to all sorts of different people, places, and things in ways that we know and in ways that we cannot possibly imagine. themes like intellectual humility, which I think is increasingly important now, and I think probably really aligns with a lot of your interests, Drew. The idea that, we really can never know all the causes and conditions that led up to any given moment. And that can actually be freeing and be a relief, as opposed to kind of an oh me, oh my kind of moment. So those are the kind of themes. But the other piece that's really key is this general idea that if these universal themes are fantastic, and we've all known people who are contemplative or spiritual or big thinkers who can really go on and on about these kind of themes. But they really, from my perspective and from the way in which I was taught by my teachers, they really only matter if you apply them to the small things that you do and say every day. So those are like the take-home points. There are a handful of universal themes that you probably know already. And what's important is to take that understanding off of the conceptual and into the action mode. And I guess there's one other thing, which is this idea of everyday enlightenment or real world enlightenment. I've gotten some pushback from Buddhists on this because it's a bit of a provocative title, apparently. But, honestly, I think probably everybody listening has experienced it. It's those moments where your conceptual mind drops out, your ego drops away, and you feel a visceral connection to something greater than yourself. They usually last just a second, but we can actually tap into that more and more frequently, extend that, and that starts to kind of change the way our nervous system operates.
Yeah, so intellectual humility is certainly one of those things. I'm holding it up. People can't see it, but I've circled, page 51. We embody intellectual humility when we focus on what we say and do instead of the outcome. And yes, so I definitely want to pull on that. But as you were talking, it struck me, sort of an enlightenment, that term, you can think about it in a few different ways, I think. And, we talk about enlightenment, liberal values, in our objective pluralism work, which is, I think, different, but sort of related. The idea that struck me, or the question, I was having this conversation with someone recently, talking about walking in the woods and hiking and really being, I think, in lack of a better term, sort of feeling enlightened, right? Like noticing the world around you and the beauty of it and the complexity and all of the things that you can imagine one might notice on a beautiful hike. And I think that is a version of this, but then there's also, for me, when I think about mindfulness, I think about it more, if this makes sense, sort of a meta of sort of constant. It's sort of, to me, in some ways, like I'm not big on holidays, but I'm big on thinking about and recognizing, let's say, veterans regularly, not just on Veterans Day. And so being mindful, like I'm going to take a hike and be mindful, which is certainly powerful and impactful and important, but also then thinking about how we're sort of mindful regularly, which to me is a really important piece of health and stress management and just a way of looking at the world. So I'm curious how you think about just that idea of mindfulness and sort of unpacking the nuances there.
Yeah, I think you just described meditation practice without it being meditation. There's the formal practice, and then there's the informal practice. Or if you think of meditation, there's view, practice, and application. So the walk in the woods that you're talking about is the practice element, because the more we're able to carve out time just to do that and not to try to apply it to the sometimes messy part of our day-to-day life, the stronger our muscle for being mindful or being aware or being compassionate or being wise becomes. And then it's more effective in the messiness of everyday life. So that's the practice piece, that walk. And then while you're walking, that sense of your ego dropping away and you're being part of just a speck of some vast interconnected universe. Those trees are talking to each other underground, and the birds are hearing things and seeing things that we can't possibly see. And when we start sensing that, that's the view aspect: view, meditation, application. And then it also has the effect of recharging our nervous system, which is not something they talk about in classical meditation training, but something that is a really important component that we need to add in. So that's what you're doing there. And then you're able to take that and apply it in everyday life.
Yeah. Well, just to reiterate or stress one of those points, at least in my experience, or at least intuitively, it's true to me that managing one's stress and being mindful is a great way to do that, is not only emotionally healthy, but I think it seems intuitively true that it helps our immune system and, keeps us from being sick. Talk about the ways in which we avoid COVID and flu and all these kinds of things. And just to me, it's a really important piece. How do you think about the idea of prayer, whether it's, Christian prayer or whatever kind of prayer it might be? How does that fit with sort of meditation and mindfulness in your experience?
Well, I think we got to separate out what's happening in schools and what's happening outside of schools. In schools, we have to be very careful whether it's meditation, mindfulness, or prayer to kind of follow the law and, not really mess with that. But outside of schools or in schools where prayer is allowed or encouraged or part of the fabric of the school, it's all the same. In Buddhist practice, there is prayer. The question is just whether or not you are setting aspirations in general or whether you're asking for help. But the effect of it is really about inclining the mind in a particular direction, and in a direction that is oriented toward caring, toward connecting, toward compassion, and toward humility. And this sense that that the collective is, the greater parts of the universe is greater than an individual self. And that doesn't mean you don't have good boundaries, and it doesn't mean you don't have a strong sense of self, but being able to, that's where surrender comes in. That's where renunciation comes in. That's where allowing comes in. That's where faith comes in. And whether that's oriented toward a particular deity, which is across all sorts of traditions, whether it's Christian, whether it's Jewish, whether it's Hindu, whether it's Buddhist, or whether it's just, a surrender to something that is greater than you can possibly categorize or identify or compartmentalize. So that's how I view it. And remember, I come from, I'm a creature of a tossed salad religion. My dad was Catholic, far more religious than my mom, who was Presbyterian, but he had to give up his religion at that time to marry a Presbyterian. I married a Jewish guy. I became a Buddhist, and my kids were both bar and bat mitzvah. So I found the same sense of connection and compassion and peacefulness in each one of these religious traditions, because I really attended all of them pretty regularly over different periods of my life.
So let's talk a bit, I think, about I guess I'm thinking about teachers and people working in the education space, which is, in this case, not unique, that there's lots of turmoil, lots of stuff going on in our politics and, issues, and we're all spun up about culture war stuff, but teachers are, is the Department of Education going to be abolished, or am I going to get fired for saying the wrong thing? I can go down a list of things, but one of the things that I think can be really helpful is to lean into some of these practices So I'm curious, do you have some maybe experiences to share or stories with teachers, or how you might help them, like suggestions for them as they think about sort of navigating this world that has us also spun up?
Yeah. Well, I think of these practices, it's a bit like a 1-2 punch. I mean, the first thing that we need to all learn, and if you're new to this, the first thing to learn are the mindfulness based or the awareness based quieting and focusing tools, the ones we're talking about earlier that actually do and have been now shown, research shows, do down regulate your nervous system. So those involve moving attention away from rumination, away from what you're thinking about, away from your worries, into a neutral or pleasant present moment experience. And that can be the feeling of your feet on the ground, listening to sounds. It can be looking at something. It can be repeating a phrase or a word, an aspiration, a mantra in your head silently. And also, these things do not need to be done while you are sitting still. They can be done and are often more effective when you're moving, when you're walking, when you're swaying side to side, when you're squeezing a pillow. And this is true for kids as well as adults. So there's not a need to be still or quiet when we are practicing mindfulness. And that's an important thing to remember. It makes it more accessible to people. The other piece of the puzzle when trying to understand mindfulness-based strategies where we're dealing with, speedy energy and restless thoughts, busy minds, is this idea the more you resist, the more it persists. And that is true with thoughts and emotions too. There's that great practice, for lack of a better word, that was tested by a social psychologist. I will remember this, but I don't remember right now. And the idea is that you should just right now close your eyes and try not to think of a pink elephant. And if you're like everybody I have ever led in this practice, which now is quite a few, afterwards, everybody's thinking about a white elephant or a pink elephant or whatever is the prompt. Some people say, don't think about pizza, don't think about green salad, but whatever it is, try not to think about it the more you think about it. So the idea isn't to get rid of these pesky thoughts. The idea is to be able to have enough space in your head for them to continue until they slow down and settle, which they will, going back to that universal theme of everything is changing all the time. So that's the first thing, is learning the mindfulness-based strategies or the awareness-based strategies that help you regulate. Because when we are upregulated, when we're overly excited and upset, we can't really think very clearly. And that's also just basically the way our nervous systems are wired based on the stress response. It's a survival instinct. So that's the first thing. And then the other thing, once you're able to do that, is the idea of, if you're in a toxic environment or you're in a stressful environment, to be able to, before you get to the point of being up, stressed out or worked up or wound up, try to interrupt regular routines with brief moments of awareness. Just stopping, and the equivalent of stopping and smelling the roses, and trying to get ahead of it, and just stopping and taking in the good, stopping and, giving yourself a break, stopping and having a cup of tea, or even if it's just to enjoy that sip of tea, but to not let the stressful environment that you're in just start to slowly escalate. So that kind of interrupting all of this with these brief moments of awareness. And those are two of the three handiest and easiest things to just drop in for absolutely anybody. The third is, and I just think this is a game changer, and I'd be surprised if we haven't talked about this before, is just appreciation. When we're talking about our survival response, we're talking about stress and the fight, flight, and freeze, which is the first thing I was talking about with the mindfulness-based strategies to downregulate. We have another survival response, which is called a negativity bias, which is we are hardwired to pay more attention to what scares us than what makes us happy. It makes sense, because pay attention to what scares us is because we want to survive any threat. But in modern world, that's gotten a little bit sometimes gets misappropriated, for lack of a better word, and we end up paying attention to a lot of things that really are not threatening to us. The story I often tell is I ask people, have you ever been to a party, you have a good time, and then somebody makes a snarky comment when you're driving home or you're in bed at night, what are you thinking of? Are you thinking of the great time you had at the party, or are you thinking of the snarky comment? And usually it's the snarky comment. So we don't beat ourselves up for that. It's a natural response that serves us well when we're threatened or when there's something we have to worry about. But we just try to broaden our perspective by also taking in the good, noticing some good things that are going on around right now, even if it's as simple as, well, at least now I'm home, I'm in bed, it's really comfortable, and this is a good thing. And just kind of soaking up some of that to help offset that negativity bias. So those are the three things I would say.
Yeah.
We can really use right now in this kind of crazy moment we're in.
Yeah, well, I talk with people who say, they're having a hard time sleeping, their kids are having a hard time sleeping. You're seeing people having, dysregulated responses that are, cognitive distortions, discounting the positive, all those kinds of things. I think especially like sleep is a really good example where people really struggle to sleep, and almost always, at least it seems, again, intuitively true to me, maybe this is not actually empirically true, but the reason that people are struggling to sleep or stay asleep is because their mind is working, and a way to alleviate that is to be mindful and do some sort of meditative practices, but it's really hard, right? That's, people say, well, I try, but it's really hard, which you want to say, that's, yes, you're right, and it's hard, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't continue. But to your point, like the more you think about it, the harder it can become. So, I guess maybe if you can kind of talk a little bit more about that, because I think there's two things. You're trying hard not to think about things, or trying too hard to sleep. And in some ways, you can almost probably try too hard to be mindful or meditative, right?
Oh, absolutely. But sleep is something I think a lot about, because it's something that, I don't know anybody, even people who are, big deal meditators, who don't struggle with sleep at some point. And there's just so much else besides what's happening in your mind that affects sleep. Mm-hmm. So, that whole sleep hygiene thing, it really is important to remember. And if listeners aren't familiar with it, it's like the effect of a late meal on your sleep is remarkably bad. If you have, a big bowl of ice cream right before going to bed, if you have that glass of wine right before going to sleep, it may help you fall off to sleep, but it's going to wake you up in a couple of hours. So these kind of things, exercise, sleep routine, trying to get to bed around the same time, trying to get up around the same time, a cooler bedroom. I mean, these are basic, science-based hacks that really do help with sleep, because sometimes we just blame it all on the mind, which is really easy, right? We blame everything on ourselves because we feel we can control it. If it's my fault, I can fix it, right? So that builds this kind of beating up on ourself mechanism that isn't very helpful. But to get to what your question is, once you've kind of cleaned up your sleep hygiene and tried not to have those late meals and that kind of thing, I just think there are the activities that I was just talking about before, moving your attention away from what you're thinking about into a sensation, whether it's the feeling of the sheets over you, whether the feeling of yourself against the bed, whether it's breathing, whether it's purposeful breathing to account, those kind of things. The thing that really helps with breathing to account is not just the down regulation effect of mindful breathing, but also it's a little like counting sheep, right? It's one of the meditation teachers talks about that sort of thing as training wheels for the mind, because you're focusing on the counting breaths or on the extension of breath, and that is kind of precluding your mind from ruminating on all this other stuff. So those things really, really help. But I also would encourage you to consider, your listeners to consider reframing, because reframing is a kind of goes to what we were talking about a bit ago about the negativity bias, the idea of, okay, right now things are really rough. And, as we were talking about before, I've actually just gone through a period where there's been some pretty intense family stuff that has been very rough.
Both of us.
So both of us, exactly. So you can't deny the fact when you're lying in bed, and especially if you're a busy parent or a busy teacher or a busy professional, first time you've had some quiet, you can't deny the fact that that's when all of these other thoughts that just you haven't had time for come up. So we don't beat ourselves up for that, but reframing to, okay, that's happening, but right now I feel pretty darn good in this bed right now, to something that is more positive. I'm looking over and my kids are in the other room and everybody's okay right now, and trying to reframe a little bit, that also can help balance this out.
Well, I've found with sleep, just to stay on this point for a moment, like, for example, my father struggles to stay asleep, and he talks, a lot of these sleep hygiene things, and, I don't want to eat after 6 o'clock, and sometimes it feels a bit obsessive, but then he still struggles to sleep, whereas I have not found a lot of, I feel like I can eat fairly late, and, perhaps it's different from person to person. Certainly if I have a lot of alcohol, that's not very good sleep, things like that. But one of the things I've noticed as I've gone, through the past, let's say 7 years, because again, I think I mentioned my divorce was in 2017, lots of things that were keeping me from staying asleep, and boy, that was just a real struggle. And then as I moved through that and worked through that, just cognitively, emotionally, getting to a point where I was sleeping pretty regularly, but I felt like it was really useful to, let's say, put on Netflix for 30 minutes, and for me, something where it was a comedy show, so I'm not following the story, but I can pay attention and just sort of drift off. And what that did for me was to sort of occupy my mind, keep me from thinking other things. And then moving beyond that now, where I was like, okay, I don't need that anymore, and I can fall asleep without that and don't need that sort of crutch. It almost feels, I hate to even talk about it out loud. It's sort of like being a pitcher and on a no-hitter, like you don't mention it, right? Like to even articulate it is sort of scary. It's like, oh, tonight I'm going to start ruminating. But I feel like I've come to a place where when I lay down, I tend to realize and recognize that that's why I'm here, and I might have some rumination, but then by just sort of practice or norm or something like that, I've been able to sort of on almost every night just sort of fall asleep. And so to me, it does feel like it's sort of how you're thinking about it and how you're framing it. And one of the things that's been helpful for me, and you can probably identify which of the principles this is that I've recognized that I might not be able to stay asleep. I might actually have a hard time falling asleep, and I might actually wake up at 2 a.m, but that's okay. Like, that's not the end of the world. So I don't know which principle. I'm curious how you sort of think about that and what principle it is, and maybe you can run with that a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's those are two. I agree with you, and I think you just kind of beautifully illustrated this idea of kind of a combination of reframing and allowing. It's easy for us when we're ruminating to start framing toward negative, and even to the fact of ruminating is negative. And going back to the white bear or pink elephant story we just said, the more you think about that, the more that will persist. What you resist persists. So reframing it a little bit so that it is normalized, so that, all right, this is just what happens. It happens to everybody. Sometimes it happens to me more sometimes than others. This is just what it is. That takes the fang out of it, and that helps. And that's a lot of what allowing is. A lot of what allowing is, it's not giving up. It's not saying, oh, I'm not going to try to get better at something. Oh, I'm going to give up the fight. But what it is recognizing right now, at this very moment, the best thing I can do is to relax, let go, and sleep if I can. And if I can't sleep, you know, can I just enjoy this moment here lying down in bed? And then also, if you're even, because we are in a city sometimes and we're out in the country sometimes. And even if you're in the city, you can shift your attention to the sounds outside, and you can hear the cars, and you can hear, maybe the garbage cans getting picked up in the morning, that sort of thing. And that again is bringing your attention and moving it out of the rumination space into an external sensory experience. And if you're at home, maybe you hear some wind outside, or maybe you hear some birds waking up in the morning. And again, shifting your attention away from the internal experience to an external sensory experience. That too has a way of just kind of settling our minds and bodies. And if it doesn't put us to sleep, at least it makes the experience more restful.
Yeah. Are there things, especially in terms of sleep and anxiety, that you think are important to point out or talk about with kids and adolescents, and maybe even thinking developmentally, because there are differences between, elementary age kids and like my daughters being teenagers.
Mm-hmm. Well, with kids, I just think it's important to reinforce these general rules. Again, it's a 1-2 punch. Just generally first teach them very specific tools to help them feel better when they're overly excited and upset, when their minds are overly busy, or when they have a lot of busy, speedy energy. And often for kids, actually often for adults too, but kids are more open to it. Often that will involve some kind of movement. So even if it's because if you have all this pent up energy, if you shake it out, you can really just shake it out and then settle back down. That has a way of releasing speedy energy. But there is a strategy there. And if your listeners interested in this, Peter Levine has a great book out called Trauma Proofing Your Kids. And one of the things he talks about is, I'm sure you've seen kids with a lot of nervous energy running around the playground, or running in the backyard, or running in your kitchen, just getting more and more worked up, right? So if you're trying to release speedy energy with movement, you need to have some kind of contained movement, either running in a specific place or shaking or that sort of thing, and then quiet. So you can pendulate, you go back and forth between shaking out that speedy energy and then calming, feel your feet against the ground, feel your breathing. You do that a couple of times, and that has a way of bringing the energy down. So those sort of practices that help kids just basically feel better once they notice that they're feeling overly excited or upset. Those are the first things to teach them. Mm-hmm. And then we go back to the universal themes, like the ones that are, we talk about how everything is changing. So if you just hold on, things are going to change. Or how, being kind doesn't just include being kind to other people, it includes being kind to yourself. So don't beat yourself up. Some of these things are just normal, natural things that happen in life. And helping to get people, kind of a broader perspective on what's happening now.
Well, again, as you're talking, I'm thinking about something that I've mentioned on the podcast here a few times. I'm curious if there's anything additional that we haven't talked about that makes sense to mention here. You're probably familiar with Jonathan Haidt's work and The Anxious Generation and all of these kinds of things. And one of the things that seems clear to me, and I actually wonder if there's something generationally of, like, I'm 55, so whatever, age 50 and up, parents that are age 50 and up, the anxiety levels of us tend to be reported to be lower, but that obviously teenagers are pretty anxious, but so are lots of adults. And then, of course, lots of those adults are parents of those teenagers. And it strikes me as it has to be true that lots of the anxiety that these parents are experiencing is perhaps either being transferred to or maybe fostering anxiety in their kids. And the ways in which they might engage in sort of mindfulness and meditation might be an antidote to help them, not only if, asking their kids to practice those things, but then what do their kids see and how do they see their parents reacting to things and interacting with the world, and how that might have an effect. I mean, I can tell you that my daughters are far less reactive to things like, the morning after the election, they were like, Trump was elected. And, they're not Trump fans. Some other things that have happened in the world that, they certainly are not particularly happy about, but aren't, going through withdrawal or not going to school because of. Whereas I've heard other parents of similar age and similar sort of socioeconomics and, lots of things being constant, that my kid can't even go to school or can't study this, or they're just really, really reactive to those things. And I have to believe, or at least I want to believe, that that demeanor and the ways in which we frame things in, again, mindfulness. So long-winded way to ask, are there additional things to say about that sort of relationship and that sort of interaction that are important here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, emotions are contagious, and so are levels of energy. So the contagion that happens when the parent is anxious is just palpable. And the same with the kind of energy that you take into a room. I mean, we've all been in rooms where everybody's sitting there having a good time, and somebody comes in and kind of sucks all the energy out of the room. They're just got a Debbie Downer, to kind of age myself with that one. And all of a sudden, everybody feels it, And we've all been in situations where the opposite is true. We've all been in situations where somebody walks into a room and they're happy and they're joyful, and it just raises the level of energy, of positive energy in the room, as opposed to creating a higher level of stressful energy. So these things, this type of energy, the qualities that we put out in the world, our emotions, all of that is contagious in the way we act in the world. So that's one of the reasons, one of the biggest stumbling blocks that I often face when training caregivers, whether they're teachers or clinicians or parents, is that they'll say, hey, why, I think it's great that my kids learn this. I really want them to learn it. But for me, it feels a little self-indulgent. I mean, I would be better off making a little bit more money, getting some cleaning done at the house, getting some chores done. That's a better use of my time than, what is perceived to be going off and sitting on a cushion and kind of contemplating your navel. But when people understand that this type of inner work has an outer ripple effect, and if we can just be a little less neurotic, a little less reactive, a little kinder, and a little bit more compassionate and open-minded, that has an effect on everybody around us. And I think that's what you're describing with your kids. I think the other really important thing to remember about this type of work and this way of being in the world is that the benefits, the growth may not really be obvious at first. Many people, both people who are out teaching it and people who are practicing it, have asked me, how can you tell when progress is being made? How can you tell when something is actually working? Because it's not so obvious all the time. And one of the ways that I can tell when people who have been practicing, where they're starting to actually integrate it, is stuff doesn't seem to stick quite as much or last quite as long. And that's what I was hearing when you were describing your kids' reaction to the bad news that is from their perspective, the bad news. I mean, it's not like they're denying that something happened that is not consistent with what they wanted to happen.
Right.
But it didn't stick so long. And I've been very fortunate to be able to study with and meet some true contemplatives who have spent, lifelong practices. And these guys are Tibetan. And one thing that I have really noticed is stuff just doesn't stick. They have a reaction, they're human, but it just tends to be, I kind of joke about it being like Teflon. It just kind of washes off pretty easily.
Well, I was thinking about the subtitle here, the discovering the ordinary magic in everyday life. And, I think that's a real important part of it, right? It's not just that you're reframing things. It's not just that you're, taking time out and, like she said, sitting on a cushion or going for a walk or whatever that might be, but that you're recognizing you're not always catastrophizing. You're not always thinking about and ruminating about all of these bad things. And there's plenty of bad things to think about. Part of that, of course, is, what can you control and what's the point of thinking all the time about things you can't control, but noticing those moments and noticing the things that are important, and giving people your attention. People say sometimes, the greatest gift you can give somebody is your time, but I would disagree. It's your attention, and there's a really important distinction there. I say all that just to sort of build on the again that sort of subtitle, because it isn't just sort of being better regulated. It's also modeling and pointing out and saying, oh man, look at that sunrise, or those kinds of things, right?
Yeah. And I agree with you about attention. The quality of attention, the quality of presence, that is the greatest thing we can offer someone else. And I don't know if you're running into this. Well, you have teenagers. I also have 30-year-old kids, and now I'm even seeing it with older people. Just the rise of the why bother, the sense that, the world is so messed up. The environment is shot. There's just, if depending on your politics and depending on the day, the systems are rigged or something like that. So given that, why bother? And that is something that the type of reframing and kind of really digging into these universal themes that we're talking about can help make a little bit less concrete, because that's the problem. This stuff gets very solid and concrete in our minds and our hearts, and then as a result in our actions. And that is what these types of activities, where we develop awareness and attention, so balance and compassion, and we start to notice the just constantly changing characteristic of absolutely everything, and how it's all dependent on multiple parts and multiple pieces that are changing and are interwoven. And when we're able to sort of relax our shoulders and see that, things don't seem quite so tight anymore. Things start to loosen up a little bit. And then when things loosen up a little bit, we can start to see our way around where, I may not be able to do anything about this big problem, but I can do something about this little corner of a problem right here. And that not only is an altruistic thing to do, but it's also going to make me feel better. And I think that's really, really important in times like this that are very confusing for people, is to be able to find ways out of this, solidification of thoughts, emotions, perspectives, points of view, that often end up in either, of an aggressive response, like a fight response, a freeze response, which is more like a why bother response, and being able to loosen up that kind of really solidification of view.
Well, one of the things that you write about is, or mentioned at least several times, is this just right for me rule. And I think that is an interesting thing to think about, because there are gradations of how people, to what extent they might engage in this, and how it might look, and what forms it might take for them. I imagine people who are, like, I don't know how you would describe them, but skeptical of any of this, right? That, oh, this is hippy dippy or stupid or not masculine enough, or, I can imagine some other things. But so I guess if you can talk a bit about that just right for me rule and trying to think through that as somebody who may even be a skeptic, and as a sort of corollary to that, or an addendum to that question, is there some basic level of engagement in this that is necessary to get some, I guess, results, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, well, let me start with the last first, which is just considering it is engagement. And I'll take it. As I said at the very beginning, I was a lawyer for 20 years, so I came into this a little differently than people who might have come in from a different doorway. So, there is very little that anybody can say to me right now that's going to hurt my feelings. And that's very useful in this line of work, let me tell you. Especially, like I said, I just came back from my hometown in the Midwest where there's a lot of skepticism over this. So just the fact that somebody's considering it, because honestly, seeds get planted, and planting seeds, some of them take, some of them don't, but whatever it's going to be, it's going to take time. But the other piece that I think is extremely important from the point of view of just right for me is that we accept that as a way of forget what other people are thinking. Just give ourselves a break and accept ourselves that this is just right for me. I mean, you actually just identified, you demonstrated the just right for me school rule when we were talking about sleep. I was saying to you, late meals mess up sleep. You were saying, well, they don't for me. And that's okay. It's like that's figuring out what is working for you and bringing awareness to that. And once we recognize what's right for us, then we can kind of take that understanding and put it against the understanding of kind of how learning works. And we have a comfort zone where is really important. That's where we go back to rest and recharge, but there's not a lot of learning that happens there. And then we have an overwhelm zone, which is when we were talking about all those mindfulness tools that help you down-regulate your stressed out emotions. Not a lot of learning can happen there because we're so busy in our protective, guarded mode that we don't have room for learning. But it's in that stretch zone, which is where you're just outside of your comfort zone, but not yet tipped into overwhelm. It's in that stretch or challenge zone. That's where learning takes place. So what we need to do is find that just right space for us that stretches us a little bit out of our comfort zone, but not so much that we tip into overwhelm. So if that's some guy who, is working at, I'm thinking actually, I was just in Michigan and we were cleaning out a house, and I'm thinking about the guy at the dump there, and who I went to high school with, and I'm thinking if that means for that guy, the just right for me rule is his level of being able to think, this might make sense, is just, take 3 deep breaths. It's no different than when we were growing up, but it's count to 10. Oh, okay. I get that. And that's taking him a little bit out of his comfort zone, and then a little bit more. It's like just recognizing that this is an ongoing process. It is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And just staying in the game, that's what's important. I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, in some ways it was somewhat rhetorical because I would probably answer it in some ways similar, but I think it's important for people to hear you talk about it and to just get it out on the table. You mentioned, and if you didn't, it was in my head and I mentioned it in my mind, the idea of being vulnerable, or something like that. And, I guess comfort zone kind of brings that to mind, right? There's a sort of vulnerability of doing something like this, even if you're by yourself, right? And people get uncomfortable with that, even being vulnerable with themselves. So I'm curious, one of the things we mentioned early on that I think is important to come back to here is the idea of intellectual humility, but it's not just intellectual humility, it's overall humility. And so if you can maybe say some things about that sort of idea of feeling vulnerable and how it relates to the comfort level and humility and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, well, there's a story that I will always remember was when I first started doing this work at the Boys and Girls Club. So we're talking 2005, something like that. And one of my very first classes, and we were in a corner of a Boys and Girls Club in Santa Monica, and we would just sit around in a circle and play some games, and then there would be some quiet time. And a little boy came running in, high energy, sat down. The minute he sat down, he wasn't down for 15 seconds, and the tears came. It was the first time that he had allowed himself to sit, and as people say now, feel his feels. And it was really unpleasant for him. So you think that happens to all of us. When you're talking about vulnerability, one of the reasons we feel vulnerable is that we are often pushing away a lot of thoughts and feelings. And when we sit and just allow ourselves to be open to them, some of these things come up and they can make us feel very vulnerable. And that's really worth acknowledging. So it's about finding what we never want to white knuckle ourselves through practice. We want to just find that kind of relaxed mode where we can, feel what we're feeling, do what we're doing. And then if it comes, and we have different strategies to help us manage big emotions when they come up, and when we're feeling vulnerable, to help us manage those feelings when they come up. But if those strategies aren't working, what the recommendation is, take a break, stop, come back to it again tomorrow. There's always an opportunity to begin again. So this sense of vulnerability is something that is very, very real. And I think we see a lot of masks out there that can look like anger, and can look like meanness, that are really ways of protecting. We think we're guarding ourselves and protecting ourselves, and that's what it looks like. And if you work with kids, I'm sure, especially if you work with teenagers, I'm sure you've seen, if you could see me, you'd see I've got my hands crossed, and you've seen that look. And it's very easy to think, oh, that teenager is being defiant. But what if it's just he's a little bit over capacity? What if it's just a little bit too much incoming for him and he can't handle it, and so he's going into freeze mode? So that idea of being flexible in our thinking, the humility around, we don't really know what's going on with somebody else. We can guess, but we don't really know. All of these things play into this way of being in the world that is giving people your attention, like you suggested, being more responsive and less reactive, and doing what we can when we can, but recognizing when it's time to let go.
The emotions, something like frustration or fear, those kinds of things, which are sometimes scary, right? Talking about vulnerability. When we think about mindfulness, thinking about noticing those feelings, how do I want to say this? Do we want to sort of notice them and depersonalize them? Because sometimes you talk about losing yourself in meditation and sort of, decoupling yourself from yourself. And I know you can, we can go into whether we actually have a self and what is consciousness and all of those kinds of things. Probably not in this podcast, but I guess how do you recommend or talk with parents, teachers, and kids about recognizing and I guess labeling and thinking about those kinds of sort of scary emotions?
Yeah, well, I think for this podcast, I get the sense we're talking to people who are relatively new to this.
I would say, yeah.
Yeah, and in that case, I wouldn't even go near this issue of self I mean, it's really about being aware of what's happening in our minds and bodies in our environment. So the first thing actually is just bringing awareness to that. The second thing actually is bringing compassion to that, because what we often find, and you're talking about feelings of vulnerability, when you're working with parents or teachers who have kids, they not only feel vulnerability for themselves, they feel vulnerability that their kids are vulnerable, and then they over-identify with their kids, and so then they feel this kind of double, triple, quadruple level of being vulnerable, because it's not just they are not the only ones vulnerable. Their kids are vulnerable. So they're just in this constant protective guarded mode. And it doesn't lead to feelings of peacefulness, but it also doesn't lead to a way of being able to listen and interact with other people with an open mind and an open heart. So when we view this type of behavior on our own part, we become aware of it. And if we view behavior of our own that may not be our best self, if we can view it as still a reflection of our wanting to be happy, of our wanting our kids to be happy, that's a big step. If we can view behavior that we may, or thoughts or feelings that come up that may feel unsettling to us, is we can view them as, okay, this may not be a manifestation of my best, a reflection of my best self, but it is a manifestation of the fact I want not to suffer, and I want my kids not to suffer. So that wanting to be happy and wanting my kids to be happy, that's about love, right? Really simple love. Wanting not to suffer, wanting my kids not to suffer, that's about compassion. So it starts with awareness, it moves into compassion for ourselves, starting with ourselves and then with others, and then wisdom, where we're starting to kind of put all these pieces together.
Well, I think you identified something that I talk about fairly frequently. You're using the term compassion, which I like. Empathy, I'm sure you're familiar with Paul Bloom's book, Against Empathy, and the idea that, and I do think you're talking about taking on somebody else's vulnerabilities and having that emotional empathy, which you feel their pain, so you're trying to solve the pain and the problems not just for them but for you, and that can be sort of a downward spiral, as opposed to, I think, cognitive empathy or something like that, or as Paul, I think, talks about compassion. And I think a lot of teachers and parents, that is a distinction that I would encourage them to think more about, because while it can seem, like as Paul Bloom would say, who wants to read a book called Against Empathy, right? That's the worst title ever. But his point being is that we often are having unintended consequences by engaging in emotional empathy while not actually doing the things that might actually help that person that is the victim or the one in harm's way, or things like that. One of the things that I'm certain some educators will think about, I'm sure you've heard this, I think we probably even talked about this in our previous podcast in 2019, but it certainly has not gone away and perhaps has gotten worse. The culture wars and social emotional learning and the role of teachers and mental health and mindfulness and meditation in schools. Some of it resonates with me as well. You think about, what is the role of a teacher? Are they qualified to do some of these things? Are there, again, unintended consequences that might come from asking teachers to engage with their students in a way that is consistent with some of these things? So how do you think about some of those issues?
Yeah, I'm with you. And I imagine some of the reservations you have are ones that I share. I think that the process of getting from, of making education more progressive, although that may not be the right word anymore, is a messy one. And I think there are, and I can tell you this as a program developer and as somebody who's taught a lot and done a lot of writing, the pressures from the outside to make it simple, stupid, right? I think that's from Dwight and in the office or something, the pressures to take something that's somewhat complex and make it simple so that teachers can teach it after a one-day workshop without giving teachers any follow-up, over the years, without giving them any opportunity for coaching, without giving them any opportunity for growth, or really only just giving a couple of teachers. The idea that you can give people a book and just let them, read through the manual, if involves complex emotional issues and really involves asking kids to open up, I think it's problematic. What I will say, though, is a lot of programs that did just that were able to make inroads and get things happening that, if a more cautious approach, like the one that I have always taken, could not go to scale in that way. So it's a matter of trying to balance these things. But I think the law of unintended consequences is a really good one here, because one of the things we're seeing is some backlash. And I think that it's because of a lot of the different type of things we're talking about, people trying to correct with programs that they can take to scale with issues that are somewhat nuanced.
Well, maybe that's a good stopping spot. Are there things that we haven't talked about that you definitely want to mention? Anything else from the book? And again, we'll put it, of course, in the show notes: Real World Enlightenment, Discovering Ordinary Magic in Everyday Life. And of course, I imagine it's still for sale, the Mindful Games book and the Mindful Games activity cards. But anything else that we haven't talked about?
Nope, I think we covered it. I always love talking to you, Drew, and I really appreciate the work you do out there with teachers, because I see it even in things as simple as your social media posts. You do a very good job of reflecting a level of complexity simply. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. So I thank you for all that you are doing out there.
Well, I appreciate that. I wish more people had that sentiment. Doesn't seem like it on social media, but I suppose that's the nature of the beast. Well, again, Susan, it's always a pleasure to talk with you as well. We'll put the book and those kinds of things in the show notes, and hopefully folks will check it out.
Great.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.